Chapter 1. The Expedition. The helicopter's blades churned the icy air as it dropped toward the volcanic plateau of Eldja, Iceland, on March 23, 2025. Katrín Jónsdóttir pressed her forehead to the cold window, watching the landscape unfold. A stark tapestry of ash-dusted snow and jagged basalt, scarred by ancient lava flows. The sun hung low, a pale disk bleeding faint light across the desolation, and the horizon cut too sharp against the gray sky. She tightened her harness, the straps digging into her shoulders, and stole a glance at her team, their faces lit by the cabin's dim glow. Mark Torres, the American engineer, slouched across from her, his broad frame dwarfing the seat. He toyed with a handheld GPS, his dark hair flecked with gray, his jaw tight. He'd been chatty on the flight from Reykjavik, joking about Iceland's frozen hell. But now he was quiet, focused. Beside him, Aisha Khan, the tech specialist, hunched over her tablet, her sharp features creased in concentration beneath a knit cap. She was young, maybe 30, and her lips moved silently, parsing data. Bjarni, the local guide, sat near the pilot, his weathered face half hidden by a wool scarf. His pale blue eyes flicked between the instruments in the window, restless, like a man waiting for bad news. They were here to drill an uncharted lava tube beneath Eldja, a job from Voxtur Dynamics, a corporation chasing rare minerals, or so they claimed. Katrín, a geologist with 20 years mapping Iceland's volcanic veins, didn't fully trust the gig. The pay was too good, the timeline too rushed, and the site too remote, even for her homeland's wild edges. But the lure of cracking open a new piece of the Earth's secrets had hooked her, despite the unease curling in her gut. The chopper jolted as it landed, skids grinding against rock. Ash swirled like smoke, and Katrín stepped out, the wind clawing at her face with icy fingers. The air stung her lungs, sharp with cold and a faint sulfur bite, a reminder of the plateau's volcanic roots. Mark stumbled after her, swearing as he caught his balance. "Feels like the damn moon," he muttered, hefting his duffel bag. Aisha emerged last, clutching her tablet, her scarf snapping in the gusts as she scanned for a signal. "Camp's 50 meters west," Bjarni called, his voice rough over the wind. He pointed to a cluster of orange tents, stark against the monochrome waste, and trudged ahead, boots crunching on frozen ash. Katrín followed, her pack heavy with gear, her legs stiff from the cold. The ground glittered faintly, black basalt slick with a thin sheen of ice, and the snow was patchy, more a dusting than a cover. No trees, no birds, just stone and sky stretching endless and unforgiving. Inside the main tent, Katrín shrugged off her coat, the portable heater's warmth prickling her cheeks. She spread a topographic map across a folding table, tracing the drill site with a gloved finger. "We start at noon," she said, her tone steady. "Baseline readings first, then we drill." Mark flopped onto a cot, rubbing his hands. "Sooner we're done, sooner I'm out of this freezer," he said, grinning faintly. Aisha plugged her tablet into a generator, her screen flaring with seismic graphs. "Stable, but there's noise. Low frequency, rhythmic, like a pulse." She frowned, tapping a spike. "Volcanic tremor?" Katrín asked, leaning over. Eldja had been dormant for centuries, but Iceland's guts were never truly still. Aisha shrugged. "Too regular, I'll isolate it later." Bjarni lingered by the tent flap, his silhouette dark against the gray outside. "You hear it too," he said, low and sudden. Katrín turned. "Hear what?" His eyes met hers, pale and piercing. "The hum. Been here longer than us." Before she could press, he stepped out, the flap snapping shut. Mark snorted. "Guy's got a ghost story for every rock." Katrín forced a smile, but her gaze drifted to the map. The drill site sat over a faint depression, a dip in the basalt she dismissed as erosion back in Reykjavik. Here it felt intentional, like the earth had sighed and held its breath. The wind howled outside, laced with a static hum she couldn't shake. Electric, alive. By noon, the drill roared to life, its growl drowning the wind. Katrin stood beside it, goggles shielding her eyes from flying ash, watching the bit chew into rock. The air thickened with a sour mineral scent. Aisha shouted over the noise, "Pulse is louder, subsurface!" Mark adjusted the controls, steady despite the cold. Bjarni hung back, scarf fluttering, his face unreadable. The drill hit 40 meters and stopped. "Hollow space," Mark said, peering into the dark hole. Katrin stepped closer, her breath fogging. A low hum rose from below, steady and deep, vibrating in her chest like a heartbeat older than stone. Bjarni pointed to a thin, dark plume curling upward against the sky, his expression grim. The earth felt awake, and Katrin wondered what they'd stirred. Chapter 2. The First Breach. The drill tent thrummed with the machine's steady growl as Katrin Jostotir stood near the site, her breath misting in the frigid air. It was past noon on March 23rd, 2025, and the Elja Plateau stretched silent around them, its ash-dusted basalt glinting faintly under a weak sun that clung low to the horizon. The wind had stilled, leaving an oppressive quiet that pressed against her ears like a weight. She adjusted her goggles, watching the drill's steel bit gnaw into the rock, the hollow space Mark had hit an hour ago lingering in her thoughts. A void beneath the earth, restless and waiting. Mark Torres hunched over the control panel, his broad frame tense, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. 42 meters, he called, his voice rough through the tense nylon walls. Resistance is dropping. We're close to breaking through. Katrin nodded, stepping closer to the hole. Chips of dark basalt sprayed outward, piling in a gritty heap, and the air thickened with a sharp metallic tang that stung her nose. A scent too raw for a dormant volcano. Aisha Khan sat on a folding chair, her tablet balanced on her knees, its screen glowing with seismic data. "Pulse is spiking," she said, her tone tight. "It's louder, closer, too regular for tremors." Katrin glanced at the graph, a jagged line pulsing like a heartbeat, steady and alive. Her stomach twisted, but she kept her face calm. "Keep tracking it," she said. Bjarni stood by the entrance, his scarf pulled tight, his pale blue eyes locked on the drill with a quiet dread that set her nerves on edge. He'd been silent, his unease a shadow heavier than superstition. The drill shuddered, its whine pitching high, and Mark swore. "We're in," he shouted, yanking the lever back. The bit stopped, and a plume of black ash erupted from the hole. Fine, shimmering, refusing to settle. It swirled in the air, coiling upward in hypnotic patterns that made Katrin's eyes ache. "What the hell is that?" Mark muttered, grabbing a flashlight. Its beam vanished a few feet into the dark below, swallowed whole. Aisha's tablet beeped. "Seismograph's flat," she said, tapping the screen. "But listen." She held up her recorder, and a low pulse filled the tent, deep, resonant, vibrating through the floor into their bones. It wasn't the drill, wasn't the wind. Katrin felt it in her chest, a chill creeping up her spine. "Not a tremor," she said, voice steady. Mark forced a grin. "Earth breathing, huh?" It faltered as the pulse quickened for a moment, then slowed, relentless. Katrin knelt by the hole, her gloved hand brushing the basalt's warm edge. A glint in the ash caught her eye. An obsidian shard, palm-sized, etched with jagged runes that shifted under her gaze. It burned through her glove, a sharp heat, and she dropped it with a wince. "Careful," Bjarni warned, stepping closer, his shadow long across the floor. "It's not yours." She frowned up at him. "What is it?" He stared at the shard, his hands clenched. "Old," he said. "Older than this place." Aisha replayed the pulse. A faint, distorted whisper threaded through it, stretched thin like a voice from centuries past. "Not wind," she said, her eyes wide. Mark kicked the ash pile, scattering it, but it swirled back into place, untouched. Katrin slipped the shard into her pocket, its heat lingering on her skin. The pulse thrummed on, vast and steady, a rhythm older than stone. "We stop here," she said. "Set up sensors, get a camera down, visuals first." Mark nodded, unpacking gear, but Aisha hesitated, staring at the hole. "It's watching us," she whispered. Katrin didn't reply, but she felt it. A prickling awareness, like something vast peering up from below. Bjarni muttered in Icelandic and stepped outside, the pulse trailing him like a shadow across the ash. Chapter 3. The Flicker. The camp sat hushed under the fading light of March 23rd, 2025, as dusk crept over the Eldgjá Plateau. The sun, a pale smear on the horizon, surrendered to a gray twilight that thickened the air with cold. Katrin Jonsdottir stood outside the main tent, her coat zipped tight, staring at the drill site 50 meters away. The hole gaped black against the ash, its edges still warm to the touch, and the obsidian shard weighed heavy in her pocket. The pulse from below had quieted since they'd stopped drilling, but she felt it lingering, a faint thrum in her bones, like a heartbeat she couldn't shake. Inside the tent, Mark Torres sprawled on a cot, nursing a tin mug of instant coffee. Steam curled upward, and he blew on it, his breath fogging briefly in the chill. "Day one and we're already spooked," he said, his tone light, but his eyes restless. "That ash trick, probably just static charge, right?" He glanced at Katrin through the open flap, seeking a nod she didn't give. She turned away, her boots crunching on the frozen ash as she scanned the plateau. The silence felt wrong, too complete. No wind, no distant rumble, just the camp's hum and their own breathing. Aisha Khan sat at the folding table, her tablet tethered to a tangle of sensors they'd rigged near the hole. She adjusted her headphones, her sharp features taut with focus. "Pulse is still there," she said, not looking up. Faint but steady, same rhythm as before. She tapped the screen, pulling up a waveform that pulsed like a metronome. Katrin stepped inside, leaning over her shoulder. "Anything new?" she asked. Aisha shook her head. "Just this, it's not fading. Should be, but it's not." Bjarni lingered near the heater, his scarf loose around his neck now, revealing a jaw clenched tight. He'd barely spoken since the breach, his pale eyes darting to the tent flap every few minutes. Katrin watched him, her gut twisting. "You've seen this before," she said, low enough that Mark wouldn't hear. Bjarni's gaze flicked to her, then away. "Not this," he muttered. "Something like it. Long time ago." He rubbed his hands, the knuckles red and cracked, and said no more. Mark took a sip of coffee, then froze, the mug halfway to his lips. "What the?" He blinked, and the mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Shards skittered across the nylon, coffee splattering dark and hot, but he stared at his empty palm, baffled. "I didn't drop that," he said, his voice sharp. Katrin frowned, stepping closer. "You okay?" He shook his head, flexing his fingers. Felt like it just wasn't there for a second. Aisha's watch beeped, a soft chime marking the hour, and she glanced at it, then cursed. "Wait," she said, holding up her wrist. The digital face ticked backward, seconds unwinding from 1703 to 1702, then 1701, before snapping back to normal. "Did you see that?" Her voice rose, thin with unease. Katrine's pulse quickened. "Battery glitch?" she offered, but it sounded hollow even to her. Bjarni stood abruptly, crossing to the tent flap. He peered out, his breath fogging fast, and Katrine followed. The plateau stretched dim and endless, the drill site a dark smudge against the ash. Her shadow fell long across the ground, stretching toward the hole. Too long, she realized, for the low light. She shifted and it snapped back, short and sharp, like a rubber band recoiling. Her throat tightened. "Bjarni," she said, "what's happening?" He didn't answer, just pointed to the sky. Above the drill site, the ash plume from earlier lingered, faint but visible, curling upward in a thin spiral. It pulsed. Once, twice, matching the rhythm on Aisha's screen. Katrine's hand slipped into her pocket, brushing the obsidian shard. It was warm, warmer than before, and the runes seemed to hum against her fingertips, a vibration she couldn't hear but felt. Mark joined them, rubbing his hand. "This place is screwing with us," he said, half joking, but his grin was gone. Aisha packed up her tablet, her movements jerky. "I'm checking the sensors," she said, grabbing a flashlight. "Something's off. More than data." Katrine nodded, pulling her hood up. "I'm with you. Mark, stay with Bjarni." They stepped into the dusk, the cold biting deeper now. The ash crunched underfoot, and the pulse grew louder as they neared the hole. Not in their ears, but inside them, a pressure building behind their eyes. Aisha knelt by the sensors, her flashlight trembling slightly. "Readings are steady," she said. "But this..." She stopped, staring at the ground. Her shadow flickered, stretching and shrinking in an instant, though she hadn't moved. Katrine's breath caught. She looked down, and her own shadow danced, long, short, long again, before settling. The pulse thrummed harder, a beat that didn't belong to the earth, she knew. "Back to the tent," she said, her voice firm. "Now." Aisha nodded, grabbing her gear, and they retreated, the hole watching them with its unblinking dark. Inside, Mark paced, his coffee stain still wet on the floor. Bjarni stood by the flap, his face grim. "It started," he said, barely audible. Katrine met his eyes. "What has?" He shook his head, lips tight. The pulse rolled on, faint but unyielding, and in the silence, she swore she heard it shift, like a breath drawn in, slow and deliberate, from something vast waking below. Chapter 4. The descent night draped the Eljah Plateau in a shroud of cold darkness on March 23, 2025, the sky a starless void above the camp. Katrine Jonsdottir stood at the drill site, her flashlight cutting a thin beam through the black, illuminating the hole they'd breached hours ago. The pulse thrummed faintly beneath her feet, a rhythm she couldn't unfeel, and the obsidian shard in her pocket pulsed warm against her thigh. The team had argued, Bjarni urging them to abandon the site, Mark pushing to press on. But Katrine had decided. They needed answers, and the lava tube held them. Mark Torres adjusted his harness, clipping carabiners with practiced ease. 40 meters down, he said, his voice steady but his eyes flicking to the dark. "Piece of cake, right?" He forced a grin, but it didn't stick. Aisha Khan checked her gear beside him, her flashlight strapped to her chest, its beam trembling slightly. "Sensors are ready," she said, her tone clipped. "Cameras live. We'll see what's making that noise." Her watch had settled after its backward stutter, but she kept glancing at it, uneasy. Bjarni stood back, his scarf tight around his neck, his pale eyes glinting in the flashlight glow. "You shouldn't go," he said, his voice low and rough. "Not down there." Katrin turned to him, her hood shadowing her face. "We can't stop now," she said. "If it's dangerous, we need to know." He shook his head, muttering in Icelandic, something about eating time, but didn't follow as they rigged the ropes. Katrin went first, her boots braced against the hole's edge as she rappelled into the dark. The rope hummed taut in her gloved hands, and the air grew thick, pressing against her lungs like wet cotton. Her flashlight caught the walls, smooth basalt glistening with a metallic sheen, streaked with veins of something silvery she couldn't name. The pulse grew louder, vibrating through the rope, and her stomach churned as she descended. At 40 meters, her boots hit solid ground, and she unclipped, sweeping her light across the cavern. It was vast, the ceiling lost to shadow, the floor a cracked slab of stone. Obsidian pillars jutted upward, their surfaces polished and pulsing faintly in sync with the sound. Dim glows that flickered like dying embers. Katrin's breath fogged fast, the air colder here than above, yet heavy, with a strange warmth that clung to her skin. Mark landed beside her, his boots thudding, and whistled low. "This ain't natural," he said, his beam tracing a pillar. "Looks carved." Aisha dropped next, her camera whirring as it recorded. "Pulse is stronger," she said, checking her tablet. "Matches the pillars, same rhythm." She panned her light and it caught something, a shape, tall and angular, vanishing as she turned. "Did you see that?" Her voice sharpened, but the cavern stayed still, the pillars glow steady. Katrin stepped forward, her boots echoing on the stone. The walls shimmered, reflecting her light in fractured bursts, and the air felt alive, buzzing against her face. She brushed a pillar, and it was warm. Too warm, its surface thrumming under her glove. The pulse quickened, just for a moment, and her head throbbed, a memory flashing unbidden. Her childhood home, snow piling against the windows, though it was gone as fast as it came. Mark moved deeper, his flashlight sweeping the dark. "Check this," he called, his voice tight. He stood by a crevice, its edges jagged and black, and pointed to a pool of ash, fine, swirling, like the plume from the breach. It coiled upward, slow and deliberate, and Katrin's chest tightened. "Same stuff," she said, stepping closer. The ash pulsed, matching the pillars, and her shadow stretched across it, flickering long and short, though she stood still. Aisha's camera beeped, its feed glitching, static, then a blur of the cavern, then static again. "Signal's dropping," she said, tapping it. "Something's interfering." The pulse rolled louder, a deep wave that shook the floor, and Katrin's light caught another shape, fleeting, humanoid, gone. When she blinked, her throat went dry. "We're not alone," she said, her voice low. Mark scoffed, but it was shaky. "Echo's playing tricks," he muttered, kicking the ash. It reformed, undisturbed, and he stepped back, his grin gone. Aisha froze, her flashlight trembling. "There, again," she whispered, pointing to a pillar. Nothing stood there, but the glow pulsed brighter, and the air grew denser, pressing on their ears. Katrine's hand brushed the shard in her pocket, its heat flaring. The pulse thrummed in her skull, and she swore she heard it shift, a low guttural sound like a breath drawn from something vast below the floor. "Up," she said, sharp and sudden. "Now." Mark nodded, clipping his rope, and Aisha followed, her camera dangling. They ascended fast, the caverns dark, swallowing their light, but the pulse stayed with them, louder, closer, watching from the depths. Chapter 5: The Echoes. The camp's main tent glowed faintly against the midnight dark of Elja on March 23rd, 2025, its nylon walls trembling in a wind that had risen sudden and sharp. Katrin Jonsdottir sat at the folding table, her flashlight propped up, casting harsh shadows across her face. The obsidian shard lay before her, its runes glinting like wet ink, still warm from the cavern. The pulse thrummed in her ears, louder since their descent, a rhythm that seeped into her thoughts and refused to fade. She rubbed her temples, the ache from below lingering like a bruise. Mark Torres paced near the heater, his boots scuffing the floor, his hands flexing restlessly. "That place was a freak show," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Pillars glowing, ash moving. None of it makes sense." He stopped, glancing at Katrine, seeking an explanation she didn't have. Aisha Khan sat on a cot, her tablet dark, her headphones around her neck. She'd been silent since they'd climbed out, her sharp eyes fixed on the tent flap, as if expecting something to peer back. "We saw things down there," Aisha said finally, her voice low and unsteady. "Shapes, there 1 second, gone the next." She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "And the pulse, it's not just sound anymore." Katrine nodded, her own memory of the cavern's fleeting figures prickling her skin. The air had felt alive, watching, and the shard in her pocket had burned hotter with every step. Bjarni stood by the entrance, his scarf loose, his weathered face drawn tight. He'd refused to join them below, and now he watched them with a mix of pity and dread. "You shouldn't have gone," he said, his tone flat. "It knows you now." Katrin met his gaze, her patience thinning. "What knows us, Bjarni? Tell me something useful." He shook his head, muttering, "It eats what it finds," and turned to the dark outside. Mark snorted, but it was forced. Great, cryptic bullshit from the local, real helpful. He grabbed his radio, flipping it on, and static hissed through the tent. Sharp, erratic, then steadying into a low buzz. "Base, this is Torres," he said, thumbing the button. "You copy?" The static flared, and his own voice crackled back. "Base, this is Torres." He froze, staring at the device. "What the hell?" Aisha grabbed a recorder, hitting play. The pulse rolled out, deep and steady, but woven through it was Mark's voice. "Base, this is Torres." Spoken seconds ago, now echoing from hours earlier when she tested it. "That's impossible," she said, her hands trembling. "It's live. How's it on here?" The static shifted, and Katrine's voice cut in. "Tell me something useful." Clear and cold, though she hadn't touched the radio. The tent went quiet, the heater's hum drowned by the pulse now pounding in their skulls. Mark dropped the radio, its clatter loud in the silence. "This place is messing with us," he said, his grin gone, his eyes darting to the walls. Katrine picked up the recorder, replaying it. The pulse came again, but this time it stretched, a scream, thin and warped, like a voice torn across centuries. Her nose stung, and she touched it, her fingers coming away red with blood. "You okay?" Aisha asked, standing fast. Katrine wiped her hand, nodding, but her head spun. A memory flashed. Her childhood home burning, flames licking the walls, though it stood intact miles away. She blinked it off, her breath shallow. "Fine," she lied, setting the recorder down. The pulse thrummed louder and the tense shadows flickered, stretching long, then snapping short, though no one moved. Bjarni stepped closer, his voice a whisper. "It's in the sound," he said. "Listens, takes, twists." Katrine's chest tightened. "Takes what?" He didn't answer, just pointed to the radio as it crackled again. Her voice, "Fine," looping soft and distorted. Mocking her, Mark kicked the cot, swearing. "Shut it off." Aisha scrambled for the radio, but the static flared and a new voice hissed through. Guttural, not theirs, a language none knew, sharp and endless. The pulse surged, shaking the table, and Katrine's nose bled again, a warm trickle down her lip. She saw it, her home burning, clearer now, her mother's scream cut short, then gone. Aisha clutched her head, gasping. "I heard someone calling me," she said, her eyes wild. Mark stared at his hands, flexing them. "Felt like they weren't mine," he muttered. Katrine stood, the shard flaring hot in her pocket. "We're pulling back," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "Pack up, now." Mark nodded, grabbing gear, but Aisha hesitated, staring at the recorder. The pulse rolled on, and the static whispered again. Not words, but a presence, vast and awake, threading through the echoes of their voices. Chapter 6. The Fracture. The camp trembled under a midnight sky on March 23, 2025. The Elja Plateau cloaked in a darkness that swallowed sound. Katrin Jonsdottir stood outside the main tent, her flashlight flickering as she swept it across the ash-strewn ground. The pulse thrummed louder now, a relentless beat vibrating through the basalt, and the obsidian shard in her pocket burned against her thigh, its heat seeping into her bones. The decision to pull back had faltered. Gear half-packed, the team fractured by what they'd heard, what they'd felt. The air buzzed, thick with a static that stung her skin. Mark Torres stumbled from the tent, his face pale, his hands shaking as he clutched a crumpled photo. "Look at this," he said, thrusting it at Katrine. It was the team, him, Aisha, Bjarni, and her, standing by the drill, but the date stamped in the corner read, March 23rd, 2035. Katrine was missing from the image, her spot a blur of ash. "Found it in my pack," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't take this." His eyes darted to the hole 50 meters away, its dark mouth pulsing faintly with the rhythm below. Aisha Khan emerged next, her tablet clutched tight, her scarf trailing loose. "The sensors are dead," she said, her breath fogging fast. "No signal, no power, nothing since that scream." Her hands trembled, and she rubbed her ears as if the echoes still lingered. Katrine's nose stung again, a fresh trickle of blood staining her glove, and she wiped it away, her head throbbing with the memory of her burning home, vivid, impossible, yet fading like a dream. Bjarni stayed inside, hunched by the heater, his scarf fallen to his shoulders. His hair, once gray-streaked, now gleamed white, and his hands shook as he traced the air with cracked fingers. Katrin stepped back in, her boots scuffing the floor. "Bjarni?" she said, sharp. He looked up, his pale eyes clouded, and his face seemed older, lines deeper, skin sagging. "It's taking," he rasped, his voice thin. "Years. Mine." She stared, her chest tightening. He'd aged a decade in hours, his frame frail where it had been sturdy. Mark shoved the photo into his pocket, pacing. "This is bullshit," he snapped. "Photos, voices, some kind of gas down there, screwing with us." But his hands flexed, uncertain, and his shadow flickered on the tent wall. Long, then short, then long again, though the light stayed steady. The pulse surged, shaking the ground, and Aisha gasped, clutching her head. "I saw it again," she said, her voice small. "My sister, calling me. She's been dead 10 years. Katrine's vision blurred, the tent tilting as her mother's scream echoed in her skull, sharp, then gone. She steadied herself on the table, the shard flaring hot. "We need to leave," she said, her tone firm despite the tremor in her chest. "Now." Mark nodded, grabbing a pack, but Bjarni shook his head, slow and heavy. "Too late," he whispered. "It's awake." The air thickened, the pulse rolling louder, and the tense shadows danced, stretching, shrinking, twisting into shapes that weren't theirs. Mark's flashlight flickered, then died, plunging them into gloom, lit only by the heater's glow. Aisha fumbled for hers, its beam cutting the dark, and froze. "Look," she said, pointing outside. The ash plume above the hole pulsed brighter, curling upward in a spiral that matched the rhythm in their bones. Katrin stepped out, the cold biting deeper, and the ground trembled again, a short, sharp quake that cracked the ash beneath her boots. Bjarni followed, slower now, his breath wheezing. "It took my father," he said, his voice barely audible. "Same place, years back. I was a boy. He went down, came up old, died screaming." His eyes locked on hers, hollow. "It's hungry." Mark swore, kicking the dirt, but his foot left no mark. The ash reformed, smooth and untouched. "We're not staying," he said, hoisting his pack. Aisha nodded, her flashlight trembling. But as she turned, her shadow stretched impossibly long, then snapped back with a crack that echoed in the stillness. She yelped, dropping the light, and it rolled toward the hole, its beam winking out. The pulse thrummed harder, a wave that shook Katrine's skull, and her nose bled again, warm and steady. She saw her home burn, her mother's face at the window, melting into ash. Then nothing. Mark grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice unsteady. She wiped it away, the shard searing through her coat. "We go," she said, sharp. "Back to the chopper." But Bjarni sank to his knees, his hair stark white, his hands clawing at the air. "It's here," he rasped, and the pulse shifted, a low guttural hum like a throat clearing below the earth. The ash plume pulsed once more, brighter, and the night pressed closer, alive with something vast and unyielding. Chapter 7. The entity awakens. Pre-dawn cloaked the Elja Plateau in a gray haze on March 24th, 2025. The air thick with cold and the faint shimmer of ash. Katrine Jonsdottir stood at the drill site, her flashlight trembling as she peered into the hole. The pulse thundered now, a relentless drumbeat shaking the ground, and the obsidian shard in her pocket burned like a coal against her skin. Bjarni's collapse, Mark's photo, Aisha's dead sister. The fractures had driven her back alone. She needed to see it, to understand what they'd unleashed, even as dread coiled tight in her chest. She clipped her harness, the rope taut in her gloved hands, and rappelled down. The air thickened as she descended, heavy and warm, pressing on her lungs. Her flashlight caught the cavern walls, basalt streaked with metallic veins glistening wetly, and the pulse roared in her skull, drowning her thoughts. Her boots hit the stone floor, and she unclipped, sweeping her light across the vast space. The obsidian pillars loomed taller now, their glow pulsing brighter, a rhythm that matched the shard's heat. Above, Mark Torres paced the camp, his breath fogging fast. "She's nuts," he muttered, kicking the ash which reformed instantly. Aisha sat by the tent flap, her tablet dead, her eyes hollow. "We should have left," she said, her voice flat. Bjarni lay on a cot, his hair white, his skin sagging, his breath a shallow wheeze. "It's awake," he rasped, staring at nothing. The pulse shook the tent, and Mark's photo, dated 2035, slipped from his pocket, fluttering to the floor. In the cavern, Katrin stepped forward, her boots echoing. The pillar's glow flared, illuminating a shifting mass beneath the cracked floor. Neither solid nor liquid, its edges fractal, folding into itself endlessly. It wasn't alive, not in any way she knew, yet it pulsed with intent, vast and unreadable. Her light wavered, the beam bending around it, and the air buzzed, alive with static that crawled over her skin. She froze, the shards searing through her coat, and felt it. Eyes. Not physical, but a presence peeling her mind open. Memories flooded her, her mother baking bread, the scent sharp, her first dig, dirt under her nails, a scream, her own, from a moment she hadn't lived. They slipped away, pulled like threads into the mass, and her nose bled, warm and steady. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice swallowed by the pulse. It didn't speak, but she felt it know her. Every fear, every hope, unraveling her piece by piece. The pillars thrummed louder, their glow searing her eyes, and the mass shifted, rising slightly, its edges shimmering black. Above, Aisha clutched her head, a sob escaping her. "She's calling again," she said, her dead sister's voice ringing in her ears. Soft pleading. Impossible. Mark grabbed the radio, static hissing, and shouted, "Katrin, get out!" His voice crackled back, warped and slow, then cut to a guttural hum, not his own. Bjarni's hand twitched, clawing the air. "It took him," he rasped. "My father! Down there! It'll take her too!" His eyes clouded and he aged more, skin wrinkling before their eyes. Katrin staggered, her flashlight dropping, its beams spinning across the cavern. The mass pulsed and the floor trembled, a low groan like stone splitting. Her watch stopped, hands frozen at 3:17, and the air grew denser, pressing her down. She saw her life, childhood snow, her mother's laugh, a future she'd never reach, sucked into the thing, leaving gaps in her mind. "Stop!" she gasped, clutching the shard. It flared, burning her hand, and the mass paused, its edges stilling, but the pulse rolled on, relentless. She stumbled back, her vision blurring, and grabbed the rope. The mass watched, not with eyes, but with a weight that crushed her chest. She climbed, her arms shaking, the shard's heat spreading up her arm. The pillars glowed brighter, their light fracturing the dark, and the mass shifted again, a tendril of shadow stretching toward her. Then falling back, the pulse thundered, a sound beyond sound, and she hauled herself up, breaking the surface as dawn's first gray touched the sky. Mark ran to her, pulling her from the edge. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice tight. Her nose dripped red, her coat singed where the shard sat. Aisha stared, pale. "What was it?" she asked. Katrin shook her head, her mind frayed. "Not alive," she said, hoarse. "Not dead. It takes everything." The pulse echoed up, louder, and the ash plume pulsed in the dim light, a sign it wasn't done. Chapter 8. The collapsed dawn broke over the Elja Plateau on March 24th, 2025. A thin grey light slicing through the ash-heavy air. Katrin Jonsdottir stumbled from the drill site, her coat singed, her nose still bleeding, the obsidian shard a searing weight in her pocket. The pulse roared beneath her feet, a deafening thrum that shook the ground and rattled her skull. Her mind felt frayed, gaps where memories once sat, stolen by the thing below. Mark Torres grabbed her arm, his face pale. "We're leaving now," he said, his voice sharp with panic. Aisha Khan darted from the tent, her pack slung over one shoulder, her flashlight dead in her hand. chopper's our only shot," she said, her eyes wild, darting to the horizon where the helicopter sat a kilometer off. Bjarni shuffled behind, his frame bent, his hair stark white, his breath a wheezing rasp. "No running," he muttered, clutching his chest. "It's everywhere." The pulse surged, cracking the ash beneath them, and the plume above the hole glowed brighter, curling upward like a living thing. Mark hauled Bjarni toward the chopper, his boots slipping on the shifting ground. "Move!" he shouted, dragging the old man as the plateau trembled, a low guttural quake that split the basalt in jagged lines. Katrin followed, her legs heavy, the shard burning through her glove when she brushed it. Aisha ran ahead, her scarf trailing, her breath fogging fast in the cold. The air buzzed, thick with static, and the pulse thundered, a rhythm that pulsed in their blood. They reached the chopper, its steel frame dusted with ash. Mark yanked the door open, shoving Bjarni inside. "Strap in!" he barked, climbing into the pilot's seat. Aisha tossed her pack in, her hands shaking as she buckled up. Katrin slid in last, slamming the door, her vision blurring as the pulse hammered her skull. Mark flipped switches, the engine whining to life, and the blades spun, kicking up ash in swirling clouds. "Hold on," he said, pulling the stick, and the chopper lifted, lurching into the gray sky. The ground fell away, the hole a black maw pulsing below, but the blades screeched, a sharp grating sound, and rust bloomed across them, red and rapid like time-eating metal alive. "What the hell?" Mark shouted, wrestling the controls as the chopper bucked. Aisha gripped her seat, her knuckles white. "It's doing this!" she yelled, her voice breaking. The pulse roared, shaking the cabin, and the altimeter spun wild. 100 meters, then 50, then 200, numbers meaningless. Katrin's nose bled again, dripping onto her lap, and she saw it. Her mother's face melting into ash, a scream cut short. Then nothing. The shard flared, searing her thigh, and the chopper tilted, plummeting. "Brace!" Mark roared, yanking the stick, but the blades crumbled, rust flaking away, and they crashed into the ash, metal groaning as it crumpled. Dust choked the air and silence fell, broken only by the pulse, louder now, vibrating through the wreckage. Mark kicked the door open, coughing, his hands scraped raw. "Out!" he yelled, hauling Bjarni from the wreck. The old man's skin sagged further, his eyes milky, his breath a death rattle. "Told you," he wheezed, collapsing to his knees. Aisha crawled out, her scarf torn, her hair streaked with white at the temples. "We're not getting out," she said, her voice hollow, staring at the horizon. Bent, warped, like a mirage folding in on itself. Katrin stumbled free, the shard's heat spreading up her arm. The ash swirled around them, pulsing with the rhythm below, and the sky flickered. Bright, then dark, then bright again, like a bulb failing. She turned to the hole, its plume towering now, a black spiral that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The ground cracked wider, swallowing the chopper's tail, and the pulse shifted, a low, guttural hum like a throat clearing beneath the earth. Mark grabbed a flare gun from the wreck, firing it skyward. The red streak arced, then froze midair, hanging impossibly still before crumbling to ash. "No one's coming," he said, his voice breaking, dropping the gun. Aisha clutched her head, sobbing. She's screaming, "My sister, she won't stop." Bjarni aged before their eyes, his hands clawing the air, then fell still, his last breath a whisper. "It's full." Katrin's vision swam, her home burning again, her mother's eyes, then ash, fading fast. The pulse thundered, and the ash plume pulsed brighter, tendrils stretching toward them, then retreating. "It's not done," she said, hoarse, the shard searing her hand as she gripped it. The plateau trembled, the sky flickered, and the entity's hum rolled on, vast and insatiable, claiming them piece by piece. Chapter 9. The Offering. The Elja Plateau lay in shattered ruin under a flickering sky on March 24, 2025. The crashed chopper, a twisted husk half swallowed by cracked basalt. Katrin Jonsdottir knelt in the ash, her hands trembling, the obsidian shard clutched tight despite its searing heat. The pulse thundered through the ground, a relentless wave that shook her bones and blurred her vision. Her nose bled steadily now, staining the ash red, and her mind frayed. Memories of her mother, her digs, her life, slipping like sand through her fingers. The entity was taking, and they were running out of time. Mark Torres stood over Bjarni's body, the old man's white hair stark against the black earth, his skin withered to a husk. "He's gone," Mark said, his voice raw, kicking the ash that reformed instantly. His hands shook, the 2035 photo crumpled in his pocket, and his shadow flickered. Long, short, long again, though the gray dawn stayed still. Aisha Khan sat nearby, her knees drawn up, her hair streaked white at the roots. "She won't stop," she whispered, her dead sister's voice screaming in her skull, a sound no one else heard. The plume above the hole towered higher, its black spiral pulsing with the rhythm below, tendrils of ash stretching outward, then snapping back. The sky flickered, bright, dark, bright, each shift jarring Katrine's senses. She stood, the shard burning through her glove, and faced the hole. "It's feeding," she said, her voice hoarse. "Time, memories, us. We can't outrun it." Mark turned, his face tight. "So what? We just sit here and rot." Aisha looked up, her eyes hollow. "The sensors caught it before they died. It's not random. It takes what's given, what's close." Her voice broke and she clutched her head, the scream louder now. Katrine's chest tightened, the shard flaring hot. She saw her mother again, baking bread, smiling, then ash, the memory torn away. "Then we give it something," she said, sharp, "enough to stop it." Mark stared, incredulous. "Like what? Our gear, our blood?" Katrine shook her head, stepping toward the hole. "Me?" she said, "my past. Everything before today. If it wants time, I'll feed it." Aisha stood unsteady. "You can't. It'll take more. It's not satisfied." But Katrine was already moving, the pulse roaring in her ears, pulling her back to the dark. She clipped her rope, rappelling down alone, the air thickening with every meter. Her flashlight flickered, its beam bending around the cavern's walls, basalt streaked with silver, glistening like wet flesh. The pillars loomed, their glow searing, pulsing in sync with the shard. Her boots hit the floor, and the mass beneath stirred. Fractal, endless, neither solid nor liquid. It pulsed, a vast shadow that peeled her mind open, and she gasped, blood dripping from her nose onto the stone. "I'm here," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Take it. Everything I was. Leave them." The mass shifted, its edges stilling, and the pulse slowed, a deep thrum that rattled her teeth. Memories flooded, her mother's laugh, her first snow, a lover's touch, sharp and vivid, then unraveling, sucked into the thing. Her childhood home burned, her digs faded, names and faces blurred to nothing. She staggered, her mind emptying, the shard cooling in her hand as the glow dimmed. Above, Mark paced, swearing. "She's been down too long," he said, grabbing the rope. Aisha clutched her ears, the scream softening, then stopping. "It's gone," she whispered, blinking. "My sister, she's gone." The plume pulsed slower, its tendrils retreating, and the sky steadied, gray and still. Mark pulled the rope, and Katrine emerged, her face blank, her eyes dull. He caught her as she stumbled, her nose clean now, the shard cold. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tight. She stared through him, her voice flat. I gave it. Me. Before. Her hands shook, empty of memory, and she frowned, grasping at nothing. Who am I? Aisha's breath hitched, her hair still white. Katrine, you're Katrine, she said, but the name rang hollow in the silence. The pulse thrummed on, fainter but alive, and the mass below swelled, its edges shimmering again. Mark's jaw tightened. It's not enough, he said, staring at the hole. It's still here. Katrine nodded, slow, her mind a void. It's hungry, she said, the words not hers, echoing from something deeper. The plume pulsed once, bright and sharp, and the ground trembled, a warning of more to come. Chapter 10. The Inversion midday hung over the Elja Plateau on March 24th, 2025, but the sky defied time. A flickering gray that pulsed like a dying flame. Katrine Jonsdottir sat in the ash near the wrecked chopper, her face blank, her hands limp in her lap. The obsidian shard lay beside her, cold now, its runes dull. The pulse thrummed through the ground, slower since her offering, but unyielding, a heartbeat that shook the cracked basalt. Her mind was a void. Names, faces, years gone, leaving only a shell that stared at nothing, her voice a flat echo when she spoke. Mark Torres paced beside her, his boots kicking up ash that swirled and reformed. She's not Katrine anymore, he said, his voice rough, his hands flexing with restless anger. The 2035 photo burned a hole in his pocket, and his shadow flickered, long, short, twisted, despite the still light. Aisha Khan knelt nearby, her hair white-streaked, her eyes red from crying. "It stopped screaming," she said, her sister's voice silenced, but her hands shook as she clutched her dead tablet. She gave it everything, and it's still here. The plume above the hole pulsed brighter, its black spiral towering into the sky, tendrils stretching then snapping back. The ground trembled, a low groan splitting the ash, and the air buzzed with static that stung their skin. Katrine's head tilted, her voice monotone. "It's hungry," she said, the words not hers, dredged from the entity below. Mark spun on her. "Stop saying that!" he snapped, but her blank stare didn't flinch, and the pulse quickened, rattling his teeth. Aisha stood, pointing to the sky. "Look," she said, her voice trembling. Above, the ash plume thickened, swirling into a mirror of the camp. Tense chopper, them, upside down, suspended in the gray. It pulsed with the rhythm below, a fractured reflection that bent and shimmered. Mark's jaw dropped. "What the hell is that?" he said, stepping back. The inverted camp flickered, and a shadow moved within it. His own pacing. Though he stood still, the ground cracked wider, swallowing the chopper's nose, and the pulse surged, a wave that knocked Aisha to her knees. She gasped, her voice reversing, "Selpa!" then choking as it snapped back. "Help!" she rasped, clutching her throat. Katrine rose, slow and mechanical, her words backward. "Erdnusti," then forward, flat. "It's hungry." Her eyes reflected the sky, fractured and gray, and the shard pulsed faintly, warming again. Mark grabbed a steel rod from the wreck, swinging it at the ash. "Fight it then," he shouted, but the rod rusted mid-swing, crumbling to dust in his hands. The plume pulsed, and the inverted camp shifted. Bjarni's body stood, white hair whipping in an unseen wind, though he lay dead below. Aisha screamed, scrambling back. "He's there! He's moving!" The pulse thundered, and the sky flickered faster. Bright, dark, bright. Each shift warping the horizon into a jagged curve. Katrine walked toward the hole, her steps unsteady, her voice a drone. "It takes," she said, blood trickling from her nose again. Mark lunged, grabbing her arm. "No more!" he yelled, pulling her back, but her skin was cold, her gaze empty. The ash swirled around them, pulsing with the rhythm, and the inverted camp grew sharper. Mark's shadow swung a rod. Aisha knelt, Katrine stood, all wrong, all alive in the sky. The ground split, a fissure racing toward them, and the pulse roared, shaking their skulls. Aisha's hair whitened fully, her scream reversing then silencing as she fell, clutching her head. Mark's hands aged, veins bulging, skin spotting, then snapped back, young again. "It's breaking us," he said, his voice cracking, staring at the fissure. The plume pulsed, tendrils reaching down, brushing the ash before retreating, and the inverted camp pulsed brighter, a mirror of their ruin. Katrine pulled free, her voice flat. "It wants more," she said, stepping closer to the hole. The shard flared, burning her hand, and she didn't flinch. Mark grabbed her again, his grip desperate. "We're not feeding it," he shouted. But the pulse thundered, and the sky cracked, a jagged line splitting the gray, the inverted camp bleeding ash downward. Aisha sobbed, her words backward. On, then forward. No, no. The fissure widened, the pulse a deafening hum, and the tendrils stretched again, curling toward them. Katrine's shadow stretched upward, merging with the inverted sky, and the shard pulsed hot, its runes glowing. The entity's hunger pulsed through them all, a void that bent reality, and the camp above and below shimmered as one, teetering on collapse. Chapter 11. The Last Stand. Afternoon bled into chaos over the Elkja Plateau on March 24, 2025, the sky a fractured gray, pulsing with unnatural light. Katrine Jonsdottir stood near the hole, her face blank, the obsidian shard glowing faintly in her hand. The pulse thundered through the ash, a relentless roar that cracked the ground wider, and the plume towered above, its tendrils curling downward, brushing the earth before snapping back. Her voice droned. "It wants more." The words not hers, echoing from the void within her hollowed mind. Mark Torres gripped her arm, his hands trembling, his face etched with exhaustion. "No more feeding it," he said, his voice hoarse. The 2035 photo crumpled in his pocket. His shadow flickered, long twisted, short, mirroring the inverted camp in the sky, where his own form paced endlessly. Aisha Khan knelt by the wrecked chopper, her hair stark white, her hands steady despite the terror in her eyes. Aisha rigged the last charge, her breath fogging fast. "Drop them deep," she said, her voice steadying. Mark tied the bundle to a rope, lowering it into the dark, his flashlight dead, the glow of the shard their only light. The pulse thrummed louder, shaking the rope, and Katrine's shadow stretched upward, merging with the inverted sky. "It's hungry," she droned, stepping closer, her eyes reflecting the fractured gray. The charges hit bottom, and Mark pulled the rope free, his hands shaking. "Ready," he said, backing up. Aisha clutched the detonator, her thumb hovering. "Get clear," she warned, but the ground split again, a crack racing toward them. The pulse roared, and the tendrils lashed down, coiling around the hole's edge, black and shimmering. Katrine's voice reversed. "Ignost," then snapped forward. "It's hungry." Her nose bled faster, and she swayed, the shard pulsing in time with the plume. Mark grabbed her, dragging her back. "Now!" he shouted, and Aisha pressed the button. The charges ignited, a muffled boom echoing from below, and the ground buckled, collapsing inward. Ash erupted, a choking cloud that swallowed the plume, and the tendrils thrashed, snapping upward as the hole caved in. The pulse faltered, a stuttering beat, and the sky flickered, bright, dark, bright, then steadied, the inverted camp dissolving into gray. Katrine fell to her knees, the shard dimming, her blood pooling in the ash. "It's full?" she whispered, her voice her own for a moment, then flat again. Mark coughed, waving the dust away, his hands steadying. "Did it work?" he asked, staring at the rubble. Aisha wiped her face, her white hair stark against her skin. "It's quieter," she said, but her eyes stayed on the ground, wary. The pulse lingered, faint but alive, a low hum beneath the debris. The ash settled, pulsing once, then stilling, and the tendrils were gone, swallowed by the collapse. But the sky remained cracked, a jagged scar, and the shard in Katrin's hand warmed again, its runes glinting faintly. Mark's shadow stretched, then snapped back, and Aisha's breath hitched, her sister's scream echoing once, then fading. "It's not dead," Katrin said, her voice hollow, standing slow. "It's waiting." The rubble trembled, a faint quake, and the pulse thrummed on, soft but unyielding, a promise etched into the earth. Mark clenched his fists, the photo slipping to the ground. 2035, staring back. Aisha nodded, her face grim. "We slowed it," she said. "That's all?" The plateau lay silent, but the air buzzed, heavy with the entity's gaze, biding its time. Chapter 12. The Residue evening settled over the Eltja Plateau on March 24th, 2025. A bruised gray sky scarred with jagged cracks, the air heavy with ash and silence. Katrin Jonsdottir stood by the collapsed hole, her face blank, the obsidian shard cold in her hand. The pulse thrummed faintly beneath the rubble, a whisper of the roar it had been, but its presence lingered, a weight in her hollowed chest. Her mind was a void, memories gone, her past fed to the entity, leaving only a shell that moved, spoke, but didn't feel. Blood crusted her nose, her coat singed where the shard had burned. Mark Torres leaned against the wrecked chopper's frame, his hands raw, the 2035 photo clutched tight. His shadow stayed still now, but his eyes darted to the horizon, bent and warped like a dream he couldn't wake from. "We stopped it, right?" he said, his voice rough, seeking an answer no one had. Aisha Khan sat nearby, her hair stark white, her pack abandoned. She stared at the rubble, her sister's scream silenced, but her hands trembled, tracing the air where the inverted camp had hung. "Slowed it," she corrected, her tone flat, "not stopped." The rescue chopper's blades thumped in the distance, a faint hope cutting through the stillness. The collapse had bought time, hours, maybe days, but the pulse hummed on, soft and steady, vibrating through the ash. Katrin's head tilted, her voice monotone. "It's waiting," she said, the words dredged from the entity's echo, not her own. Mark flinched, his grip tightening on the photo. "Shut up," he muttered, but his eyes lingered on her, searching for the woman she'd been. The chopper landed, kicking up ash in swirling clouds, and a pilot waved them over, his face masked by a helmet. "Move it," he shouted over the roar, and Mark hauled Katrin toward it, her steps slow, mechanical. Aisha followed, her boots dragging, her white hair whipping in the wind. They climbed in, the cabin cold and stark, and the pilot pulled up, the plateau shrinking below. A cracked wasteland, the whole a dark scar sealed with rubble. Katrin sat by the window, her eyes dull, reflecting the fractured sky. The shard rested in her lap, its runes glinting faintly, warming against her skin. She didn't blink, didn't speak, her breath shallow as the pulse faded with distance, faint but alive. Mark slumped beside her, the photo slipping to the floor. Him, Aisha Bjarni, her absence, a blur of ash. "What's left of you?" he asked, low, but she didn't answer, her gaze lost in the gray beyond. Aisha strapped in, her hands steady now, but her face aged beyond her years, lines etched deep, eyes hollow. "It's in us," she said, her voice barely audible over the blades. "The time it took, it's still taking." Her hair gleamed white, a mark of the entity's touch, and she rubbed her ears. The silence of her sister's scream, a fragile relief. The chopper climbed, the plateau a smudge below, but the pulse lingered in their skulls, a thread tying them to the dark. The pilot glanced back, his voice crackling through headsets. "Reykjavik in 2 hours. You okay?" Mark nodded, a lie, his hands flexing. Young, then old, then young again, a flicker he hid. Katrine's lips moved, a whisper, "It's waiting," and the shard pulsed, its heat spreading up her arm. Aisha's breath hitched, her eyes on the horizon, bent and shimmering like glass about to break. "It's not gone," she said, her voice trembling. "It's, bigger now." Below, the rubble trembled, a faint quake rippling through the ash. The plume was gone, swallowed by the collapse, but the pulse thrummed on, a low guttural hum, like a throat clearing beneath the earth. The sky flickered once, bright, then dark, and the cracks widened. A silent promise etched across the gray. The chopper flew on, carrying them away, but the entity's gaze followed, vast and patient. Its hunger coiled in the shard, in their bones. Mark picked up the photo, staring at the date, 2035, and his own face, unaged, beside Aisha's white hair and Katrine's absence. 10 years, he muttered, his voice breaking. What happens then? Aisha shook her head, her eyes on Katrine, who stared blankly ahead, the shard glowing faintly in her lap. The pulse hummed, a residue of the abyss, and the chopper soared into the fractured sky, leaving the plateau behind, but not free, never free.